Lonely rancher rescues Apache girl hung for revenge. A western story of guilt and forgiveness. The small town of Willow Creek had always been a quiet place, nestled between rolling hills and dusty plains. Sophie lived on a modest farm on the outskirts of town. Her days were filled with chores, feeding the animals, tending to the garden, and fixing what needed fixing. It wasn't an easy life, but Sophie was used to it. She'd grown up on the farm, just like her parents before her. There were no luxuries, no comforts beyond the simple things in life, but Sophie didn't mind. She found peace in the rhythm of the seasons and the hard work of keeping the farm running. One evening, as dark clouds gathered in the sky, Sophie hurried about the house, securing windows and doors before the storm arrived. The wind picked up, and the first raindrops fell with a heavy thud against the dirt road outside. Sophie glanced out the window, watching the storm roll in, when she heard a knock at the door. Curious, she opened it, surprised to see a man standing there, drenched from the rain. His cowboy hat was tipped low over his face, but there was no mistaking the weathered look of a man who had spent years riding the open range. "Evening, ma'am," the man said, his voice low and rough. "My son and I were on the road, and we could use a place to stay for the night. The storm's got us caught out here." Sophie took a step back, surprised by the sudden appearance. She didn't normally have visitors, especially not strangers, but something about the way the man carried himself made her feel that he was trustworthy. His eyes were kind, though tired, and his young son, probably no older than 7 or 8, stood behind him, clutching a small bag. "You're welcome to stay," Sophie said after a moment's hesitation. "I can offer you a warm bed for the night." The man nodded, grateful. "Thank you kindly, ma'am. My name's Jack, and this here's my son, Tommy." "Nice to meet you both," Sophie said. "I'm Sophie. Come on in out of the rain." They stepped inside, and Sophie closed the door behind them, locking out the storm. The warm glow of the fireplace welcomed them into the modest home. She quickly showed them to the small guest room where they could settle in for the night. While Jack and Tommy dried off, Sophie bustled around the kitchen, preparing a simple meal of stew and bread. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside, the small cottage was warm and cozy. Jack settled into a chair by the fire, and Tommy sat quietly, looking up at Sophie with wide, curious eyes. Sophie couldn't help but notice the bond between father and son. There was a quiet strength in the way Jack looked after Tommy, always making sure his son was warm and comfortable. It was clear that Jack cared deeply for the boy. "Is the storm usually this bad out here?" Jack asked, his voice still carrying the weariness of the road. Sophie smiled as she stirred the pot of stew. "It gets bad from time to time, especially during the spring, but it'll pass by morning. You're lucky you found a place to stay." Jack looked out the window, his eyes distant for a moment. "We've been traveling for a while now, trying to get to a new place. We've been through a lot of storms, but this one, it's the worst yet." Sophie nodded sympathetically. "Well, you're safe here tonight." As the night went on, they talked a bit more, Sophie learning that Jack and Tommy had been on the road for weeks. They didn't talk much about where they were headed, but Sophie didn't press. She sensed there was more to their story, but she didn't want to make them uncomfortable. Instead, they focused on small talk, the weather, the farm, and how the storm seemed to get worse by the hour. Sophie couldn't help but feel a strange connection to Jack. His quiet strength reminded her of her father, who had passed away years ago. There was something reassuring about his presence. Sophie wondered if it was just the familiarity of a man who had lived a life of hard work, like her own family had done for generations. The night passed quickly. Jack and Tommy went to bed early, and Sophie stayed up a bit longer, tidying up the kitchen. As she glanced out the window, the storm showed no signs of stopping. She felt a mix of concern and peace, the kind that comes with knowing you've done something good, even if you don't fully understand why. Before she turned in for the night, Sophie glanced at the clock. It was late, and she was tired from a long day of work. She set the last of the dishes down and headed to her own room, grateful for the quiet comfort of her little home. But as Sophie lay in bed, her thoughts wandered. Who was Jack really? He had the air of a man who didn't want to be recognized, who didn't want attention. He didn't speak much about himself, but Sophie could tell there was something deeper beneath the surface. She wondered if he was hiding something, but she pushed the thought aside. It didn't matter. Not really. He was kind, and he had a son who needed a safe place to sleep. Sophie's last thought before she drifted to sleep was about Tommy. He had the sweetest smile, and there was something about the way he'd looked at her when she'd brought them food, a look of trust and hope that warmed her heart. As the storm raged outside, Sophie knew one thing for certain. She was glad she had opened the door to Jack and Tommy. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could change the course of a life. The small town of Willow Creek sat quietly beneath the big sky. Surrounded by sweeping hills and dusty dirt roads, the town moved at a slower pace. Sophie had lived in the small cottage on the edge of town for as long as she could remember. Her parents had passed on years ago, and now the land was hers to care for. Life was simple, even if it was hard. The farm had always been more about survival than luxury. Sophie woke up early every day, tending to her animals, growing vegetables, and keeping the small house in order. It was the middle of spring when the storm came. The air grew heavy, and dark clouds gathered in the sky. Sophie could tell this storm would be a big one. She had seen plenty of them in her years on the farm, but this one felt different. The wind howled through the trees, making the branches sway wildly. It was as though the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. Sophie hurried through her chores, tying down loose objects and making sure the windows were shut tight. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, though she couldn't explain why. Just as she was finishing up, a sudden knock on the door startled her. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't used to having visitors, not in a storm like this. With a curious frown, she walked to the door, wiping her hands on her apron. When she opened the door, she found a man standing there, drenched to the bone. His cowboy hat was low over his eyes, and his long coat clung to his tall frame. He looked like he had been out in the storm for hours. Beside him stood a young boy, maybe 8 years old, holding a small bag. The boy's hair was wet, and his eyes were wide with uncertainty. The man looked up at Sophie, his face weary but kind. "Evening, ma'am," he said in a deep voice. "We've been traveling, and the storm's worse than we thought. Would you be willing to let us stay the night?" "Just till it passes." Sophie hesitated for only a moment. She wasn't used to opening her door to strangers, but something about the man's presence put her at ease. She looked at the boy, who was staring up at her with wide, trusting eyes. "Of course," Sophie said, stepping aside to let them in. "Come in, both of you." "You're welcome to stay here for the night?" The man nodded gratefully, tipping his hat in respect. "Thank you, ma'am. My name's Jack, and this here's my son, Tommy." Sophie smiled warmly. "I'm Sophie. It's nice to meet you both." As they stepped inside, Sophie closed the door behind them and locked it against the storm. The wind outside howled, but inside, the warmth of the cottage was a welcome relief. The fire crackled in the small stove, sending light dancing across the room. Sophie quickly moved to offer them a seat by the fire. "Please, make yourselves comfortable," Sophie said, her voice soft but friendly. "You must be tired from the journey." Jack nodded, and Tommy sat quietly, his small hands clasped together on his lap. Sophie couldn't help but notice the bond between them. There was a quiet strength in the way Jack looked after his son, and the boy seemed content to sit by the fire, despite the storm raging outside. "Thank you, Miss Sophie," Jack said, lowering his voice. "We don't mean to be a bother. We've been traveling for days now, just trying to get to a new place." Sophie raised an eyebrow, curiosity stirring inside her. "Where are you headed?" Jack paused, glancing at his son before answering. "Just looking for a fresh start. We've been through a lot the past year. We're trying to find a place to settle down." Sophie nodded, understanding more than Jack realized. Life wasn't easy in Willow Creek, but it was peaceful. She imagined that anyone who had been traveling for days, with a child in tow, would appreciate the quiet refuge that a stormy night could bring. "I'll fix you both some supper," Sophie said, her voice warm. "It's nothing fancy, but it'll help take the chill off." Jack smiled, a faint hint of gratitude in his eyes. "That's more than enough. We're grateful for your kindness." Sophie moved to the small kitchen, which was just a few steps away from the main living area. She pulled out a pot and began to prepare a simple stew: beef, carrots, potatoes, and onions. It was a dish she made often, filling and easy to prepare. As she worked, she could feel the weight of the storm pressing against the house, but inside, it was warm and safe. The sound of the rain beating against the roof was comforting, as if the world outside didn't matter for a while. Jack and Tommy sat by the fire, and Sophie could hear their soft conversation. She didn't need to listen closely to know that Jack was a man used to a life of hard work. There was a calmness to him that Sophie admired. It was the kind of calm that came with experience, the kind that only comes from long days spent working the land or the road. Sophie served the stew, and they ate together in silence. Tommy, though shy, seemed to enjoy the food, and Jack thanked Sophie between bites. As the night wore on, the storm didn't let up. The wind howled, and the rain continued to fall in sheets. Sophie offered the guest room to Jack and Tommy, knowing they needed rest after their long journey. Jack declined at first, but Sophie insisted, not wanting them to spend another hour in the cold. "I don't have much," Sophie said, "but I can offer you a warm bed for the night." Jack finally agreed, and Sophie led them to the guest room. She made sure they had everything they needed before retreating to her own room for the night. Lying in bed, Sophie stared at the ceiling, the wind whistling through the cracks in the house. Her mind wandered back to Jack and Tommy. They seemed like good people, simple folk, the kind she was used to. Still, she wondered why they were traveling so far, why they didn't have a place to call home. As she drifted off to sleep, the storm raged on outside, but inside Sophie felt a sense of peace. She had opened her door to strangers, and now, for the first time in a while, she felt like she had done something good. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a story that would change her life forever. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the sky clear and the air crisp. Sophie woke early, as she always did, the sunlight streaming in through the small window above her bed. The world outside was calm again, the wind only a whisper compared to the night before. She stretched and pulled on her worn boots, preparing to begin her day. As she moved quietly through the house, she found Jack and Tommy already up. They were seated by the fire, sharing a quiet breakfast of bread and butter, with a small pot of coffee brewing. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room, a welcome comfort. Sophie smiled at the sight of them. "I hope you both slept well," she said as she walked over to the table. Jack looked up and gave her a nod. "We did, thank you," he replied. "The storm made it hard to sleep at first, but we managed." Tommy, always a little shy, smiled at Sophie from across the table. "It was nice to be inside, ma'am. Thank you for letting us stay." Sophie smiled back, feeling warmth spread through her chest. She had grown fond of the boy over the past couple of days. He was quiet, but there was a light in his eyes that made her want to take care of him, protect him from the world's harshness. "I'm glad you're both safe," Sophie said as she poured herself a cup of coffee. She sat down beside them, taking a sip. The hot liquid was a much-needed boost, especially after the long night of worrying over the storm. The conversation was light, a mix of small talk about the weather and the land. Sophie asked about their travels, curious about where they had come from and where they were going. Jack was careful with his words, avoiding too many specifics, but Sophie didn't press. It seemed like the kind of thing that was better left unsaid, at least for now. As they finished their meal, there was a knock at the door. Sophie looked toward the sound, surprised. She wasn't expecting anyone. Jack and Tommy seemed equally taken aback. "I'll get it," Sophie said, standing up. She made her way to the door, wondering who it could be. When she opened it, she was greeted by two of the local townspeople, Mark and Steve. Both were farmers from the area, friendly enough, but Sophie hadn't seen them around in a while. They stood on her doorstep looking a bit awkward, as if they had a reason for being there but were unsure of how to approach her. "Morning, Sophie," Mark said, tipping his hat. "We just wanted to check on you. Heard there was a bad storm last night. Everything all right?" Sophie nodded, smiling warmly. "Yes, thank you for checking in. The storm passed, but we're all safe here." Steve, the quieter of the two, looked over Sophie's shoulder, his eyes catching sight of Jack and Tommy inside the house. "Who's your guests?" he asked, his tone polite but curious. Sophie turned to look at Jack and Tommy, unsure how to explain. Jack had mentioned traveling, but he had been vague about his reasons for it. Still, she didn't want to make things awkward. "These are Jack and his son Tommy," Sophie said, introducing them. "They were passing through and got caught in the storm. I offered them a place to stay for the night." Mark raised an eyebrow, glancing at Jack with interest. "Nice of you to help them out. What brings you to Willow Creek?" Jack looked at Sophie, sensing the awkwardness in the air. He stood up and walked to the door, offering his hand to the two men. "We're just passing through," he said, his voice calm. "Looking for a place to settle. We've been on the road for a while." There was a moment of silence as Mark and Steve exchanged looks. Sophie could see they were sizing Jack up, trying to figure out if he was telling the truth. There was something about Jack that didn't quite add up. He had an air of quiet confidence, but Sophie couldn't place why it felt out of place in the small town. Mark's eyes narrowed slightly. "You know, Jack, you look awfully familiar. Have I seen you around before?" Jack paused, then smiled softly. "I doubt it. We've been traveling for some time now." Steve seemed to accept Jack's answer, but Mark wasn't so easily convinced. He glanced at Sophie before turning back to Jack. "Well, if you need anything, you know where to find us. We'll let you get back to your morning." With that, the two men bid Sophie and Jack goodbye, leaving the doorway open as they walked back toward town. Sophie closed the door, a feeling of unease settling in her chest. She hadn't expected her neighbors to ask so many questions. It seemed innocent enough, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were trying to dig deeper into Jack's past. Sophie returned to the kitchen, where Jack and Tommy were finishing their breakfast. Tommy looked up at her with a small frown. "Who were they, ma'am?" "They're just some of the local farmers," Sophie replied, forcing a smile. "Nothing to worry about." But deep down, Sophie felt a growing sense of worry. The way Mark had looked at Jack, as if something didn't quite add up. She couldn't shake it. Maybe it was just her imagination, but it made her wonder. Was Jack really just a traveler, or was there more to his story? As the day went on, Sophie kept herself busy with the usual farm tasks. She worked outside for a while, tending to the animals, her mind swirling with thoughts of Jack. She couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked when the men questioned him. He didn't seem scared, just resigned, almost like he was hiding something. When she finally returned to the house later in the afternoon, she found Jack and Tommy preparing to leave. Jack was standing near the door, his coat draped over his arm, Tommy beside him, holding his bag. Sophie's heart sank. Had they decided to leave? "I think it's time we head out," Jack said quietly, his eyes meeting Sophie's. "We appreciate your kindness, Sophie. You've given us shelter when we needed it most." Sophie felt a pang of disappointment. She hadn't expected them to leave so soon, but she understood. "You don't have to go if you don't want to," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Jack hesitated, looking down at Tommy. "We've been on the road for a while, and we need to keep moving. But we'll always be grateful for your hospitality." Sophie nodded, but as she watched them leave, a feeling of confusion lingered. Why had they really come to Willow Creek? And why had Jack been so quiet about his past? As the door closed behind them, Sophie stood there, staring after them. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And then, just as she was about to turn away, Sophie overheard a conversation from outside. Mark and Steve were standing near the fence, speaking in low voices. "Do you think they're really just passing through?" Mark asked, his tone filled with suspicion. Steve's voice was quieter. "I don't know. But something doesn't sit right with me. There's more to Jack than he's letting on." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She stood still, listening to their words, realizing that perhaps she wasn't the only one wondering who Jack really was. The storm may have passed, but Sophie felt a storm brewing in her heart. Jack's secret wasn't just his to hide anymore. The next morning, the sun rose bright and clear, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. Jack and Tommy had left earlier that day, just as quietly as they had arrived. The house felt emptier without them, and Sophie missed the warmth of their company. She tried to push the thoughts aside, telling herself that it was just the sudden change, but deep down, something told her that their brief visit had changed everything. Sophie went about her chores, feeding the animals and tending to the garden, but her mind kept returning to Jack. The way he had looked at her when they said their goodbyes. There was something about it that made Sophie wonder if she would ever see them again. And why had he seemed so distant, as if he was hiding something important? After finishing her work, Sophie decided to take a walk into town. The streets of Willow Creek were peaceful, with only a few townsfolk going about their business. Sophie passed by the local general store, the post office, and the small coffee shop where she sometimes stopped for a cup of tea. As she walked, her thoughts drifted back to Jack. She found herself wondering where he and Tommy had gone, and why they hadn't stayed longer. It was then that Sophie heard the familiar voices of Mark and Steve. They were standing by the post office, talking in hushed tones, and Sophie couldn't help but overhear their conversation. "So you think Jack's really a traveler?" Mark asked. "I don't know, Steve. There's something off about him." Steve's voice lowered, and Sophie had to step closer to catch the words. "I don't trust him. He's too quiet. And Tommy, he's not the boy he seems." "They've got money, Mark. You can tell by the way they carry themselves." "I think we've got a millionaire passing through our little town, and he's been hiding it." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. Could it be true? Had she really invited a millionaire into her home without knowing it? She had seen the way Jack carried himself. Calm, quiet, reserved. But she had never once suspected he was hiding anything. Not like this. She turned away before they noticed her listening. Her mind was spinning with the revelation. Jack had left so quickly, but he had never given any hint of his wealth. Why would he hide it? Sophie had to know more. She had to understand who Jack really was. Her feet carried her toward the outskirts of town, toward the road where Jack and Tommy had left just hours earlier. She knew it was foolish to go after them, especially without knowing where they had gone, but Sophie couldn't stop herself. There was a nagging feeling in her chest that told her she needed answers. As she walked down the quiet road, Sophie's thoughts raced. Was Jack really a millionaire? If so, why hadn't he told her? Was it because he didn't want her to treat him differently? Or was there something more to his story? Something he wasn't ready to share? Sophie didn't know what to think anymore. The more she tried to piece together the events of the past few days, the more questions she had. Just as she was beginning to lose hope, Sophie saw a familiar figure in the distance. It was Jack. He was walking slowly, Tommy at his side, and they seemed to be heading toward a small farmhouse just outside of town. Sophie's heart raced, and without thinking she quickened her pace until she was close enough to call out, "Jack! Jack, wait!" Jack stopped and turned, his expression softening when he saw her. "Sophie, what are you doing here?" Sophie felt a rush of emotions. She didn't know where to start, but she had to ask. I overheard something in town. People are saying you're not just a traveler. They think you're a millionaire? Is that true?" Jack's face went pale for a moment, and Sophie could see the hesitation in his eyes. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there looking at her as if weighing his options. "I didn't mean to deceive you," Jack finally said, his voice low. "I should have told you the truth, but I didn't want you to see me differently. I didn't want you to treat me like I was above you." Sophie's heart ached as she looked at him. She could see the vulnerability in his eyes, and for the first time she understood. Jack wasn't just hiding his wealth, he was hiding himself. Hiding from the world, from a life he no longer wanted. "I didn't come here to lie to you," Jack continued, his voice steady but filled with regret. "I came here because I needed to get away. I needed a place where I could just be myself, without the weight of money and expectations." Sophie listened, taking in his words. She could feel the sincerity in them, and for a moment she wasn't sure what to say. She had known him for only a short time, but it felt like she had known him much longer. She had seen the way he cared for Tommy, the way he worked hard to provide for him, even when it seemed like the world was against them. "I never meant to deceive you," Jack said again. "I just wanted a break from everything. I wanted to live a simpler life where I wasn't judged by how much money I had." Sophie nodded slowly, taking in his words. "I understand," she said softly. "I'm not judging you, Jack. I just don't want you to feel like you have to hide who you are. Whether you're a millionaire or not doesn't change who you are to me." Jack looked at her, his eyes searching hers for any sign of doubt. "You mean that?" Sophie smiled, a small, genuine smile. "Yes, I do." For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence between them felt comfortable, as if they had finally understood something important about each other. Sophie looked down at Tommy, who was standing beside Jack, looking up at her with those big, trusting eyes. "We're not leaving, Sophie," Jack said quietly. "I thought I needed to keep running, but now I know I don't. I want to stay here if you'll have us." Sophie felt a lump in her throat, but it wasn't from sadness. It was from something deeper, something that she had been afraid to admit to herself. She had come to care for them both, more than she had expected. "I'd like that," Sophie said, her voice soft but sure. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." Jack's face broke into a smile, and for the first time Sophie saw a lightness in him that had been missing before. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "We'll stay," Jack said, "and this time, no more secrets." Sophie smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. Maybe life wasn't always about knowing everything, but about accepting what came and making the most of it. And in that moment, Sophie knew that she had found something special, not just in Jack, but in herself. A chance for a new beginning, for all of them.